This started as a dumb Saturday project. I typed George Washington's name into a genealogy database, expecting nothing. The guy's been dead for 200 years. What was a records search going to tell me that a biography couldn't? Then one record led to another, and about 4 hours later I was staring at a name I didn't expect, in a country I didn't expect, and I had that specific feeling you get when a rabbit hole turns out to actually go somewhere. So I kept pulling the thread. Washington, then Grant, then Lee, then Eisenhower, then half a dozen more, until a pattern showed up that no single biography ever mentions, because no single biography is built to notice it. You have to lay the family trees next to each other to see it at all. And once I started doing that, I couldn't stop. I had browser tabs open for parish registers in Northamptonshire, immigration manifests from the 1600s, a Y-DNA project run by genealogists I'd never heard of. And at some point around 2 a.m., I realized I wasn't looking at a handful of unrelated coincidences anymore. I was looking at a map. Here's the pattern. An enormous number of America's most famous generals, men who fought each other, men who fought for entirely different countries, men separated by 150 years, trace back to the same tiny handful of counties in Europe. Not the same country, not even the same century of arrival. The same counties, sometimes the same towns, occasionally the same church, registers 100 years apart. Nobody involved knew about anybody else. And there's a second half to this story that the pattern alone doesn't tell you. A story about exactly who was never allowed into that pipeline in the first place, and why. We'll get to that. But first, hold on to this. One of the men on this list commanded American armies against the exact country his own great-grandfather fled, and his last name, translated word for word, still describes the job. Keep that in your back pocket. We're building to it. If you're into this kind of thing, genealogy quietly rewriting what you thought you knew about history, subscribe before we keep going, because I go down rabbit holes like this every week, and this one has more turns in it than I expected when I started. George Washington's ancestry is one of the best documented family lines in American history, and it doesn't start in America at all. It starts at Sulgrave Manor in Northamptonshire, England, a stone manor house still standing today that belonged to Washington's direct ancestors for generations before anyone in the family had ever set foot on a ship bound for the New World. Lawrence Washington, a wool merchant who'd done well enough for himself to buy his way into the gentry, acquired the property in the 1500s, and it stayed in the family for roughly 120 years before his descendants crossed the Atlantic and settled in colonial Virginia in the 1650s, decades before George Washington himself was even born. By the time he was leading the Continental Army against the British Crown, his own family had already been out of England for over a century, long enough that the connection back to Sulgrave had faded into something closer to a family rumor than a lived fact. Here's where the paper trail stops being paperwork and turns into something you can actually verify with modern science, and this was my first real wait, what moment in the whole search? A project known as the Washington Family DNA Project set out to confirm this English lineage using the Y chromosome, which passes almost unchanged from father to son across generations, the same way the Washington surname itself passed down. By testing living male line descendants who share Washington's direct paternal ancestor, researchers confirmed a Y DNA signature that matches the haplogroup patterns found in populations from the exact region of England the Washingtons are documented to have come from. This isn't a family legend written into a Bible 200 years after the fact. It's a chromosome, tested in living people today, still carrying the same signature it carried when it left Northamptonshire, meaning the man who led the fight for American independence from Britain was, on a strictly genetic level, about as English as it gets. Now flip to the other side of the story nobody puts next to Washington, because it involves two men who spent 4 years trying to destroy each other's armies. Robert E. Lee's paternal line traces to Richard Lee I, who emigrated from Shropshire, England, in the late 1630s and became one of colonial Virginia's most prominent landowners. Ulysses S. Grant's patrilineal ancestor, Matthew Grant, emigrated from England in 1630 and settled in Massachusetts, with the Grant surname itself tracing back further through Scotland, tied to Clan Grant in the Highlands, before that branch moved south into England, generations before Matthew ever booked passage. So when Grant and Lee sat down in a farmhouse parlor at Appomattox in April 1865 to end the deadliest war in American history, two men whose ancestors had crossed from the same island roughly 200 years apart were formally closing a conflict fought entirely on American soil, over entirely American issues, while both quietly carrying the same British Isles migration story underneath them. Neither man would have known that. There's no indication either family ever traced the connection, no letter or diary entry where either general remarks on it. It just sat there, invisible underneath one of the most consequential handshakes in the country's history. That same British Isles thread runs through nearly every other major name from this era of the country, and it's worth grouping them together instead of walking through each one as a separate biography, because the differences between them matter less than the shared shape underneath. William Tecumseh Sherman descended from Reverend John Sherman, who emigrated from Essex, England, in the 1630s as part of the Puritan migration into New England. Stonewall Jackson's family came a different way. Scots-Irish, meaning Scottish Presbyterians who had settled in Ulster before a later generation crossed the Atlantic as part of the massive 18th century migration that populated the Appalachian frontier, a single wave responsible for filling huge stretches of what would become the backcountry South. And Philip Sheridan's family arrived more recently and more directly than either. His parents emigrated straight from County Cavan, Ireland, making him the son of immigrants in a way Washington, Lee, and Grant simply weren't. Commanding cavalry divisions, only one generation removed from the ship that brought his family over, at an age when most of the other men on this list were already 3 or 4 generations deep into being American. 3 different countries of departure, England, Ulster, and Catholic Ireland, 3 different immigration waves separated by 100 years, and all 3 converging on the same short list of Civil War commanders, each one arriving by a slightly different door into the same room. Before we go further, it's worth stopping on something the pattern itself doesn't say out loud, because a pattern this consistent isn't just a story about who arrived. It's also a story about who was legally and structurally kept from ever having a shot at arriving in this pipeline at all. This is the part of the search that slowed me down the most, because it's easy to get swept up in the fun of the coincidences. The same counties, the same islands, the ironic surnames, and forget to ask the more uncomfortable question sitting right underneath all of it. Why only these regions? Out of the entire rest of the world, people were emigrating from during exactly these same centuries. Why not everywhere? The answer is that for most of the period we're talking about, the path from immigrant family to American general wasn't open to everyone equally. It was open almost exclusively to white Europeans. And that wasn't an accident of timing, it was policy, written into law from the country's very first years. The Naturalization Act of 1790 restricted American citizenship to free white persons, which meant that for well over a century, immigrants from Asia, Africa, and much of the rest of the world had no legal path to the kind of citizenship that could eventually produce a West Point cadet or commissioned officer, regardless of how many generations their families had already been in the country. Chinese immigrants specifically were barred from immigrating at all under the Chinese Exclusion Act starting in 1882, a law that stayed on the books for over 60 years before it was finally repealed in 1943. And when Congress rewrote immigration law again in 1924, the new quota system was explicitly designed around national origin formulas that favored Northern and Western Europe, the same handful of regions this entire video has been tracing, while sharply restricting arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe, and from nearly everywhere outside Europe entirely. The pipeline wasn't just old. For a long stretch of its history, it was legally engineered twice over to stay exactly that narrow. Indigenous nations, meanwhile, weren't absent from this story because they didn't produce capable military leaders. Some of the most effective strategists and tacticians in North American history came from indigenous nations, men who outmaneuvered better supplied federal armies for years at a time using knowledge of terrain and logistics that West Point's own curriculum eventually had to catch up to. They're absent from the U.S. Army's command structure specifically because the U.S. Army spent most of this period fighting them for their land, not recruiting them into its officer corps. There was no pipeline for them to enter. There was a frontier, and federal policy placed them on the wrong side of it by design, treaty after broken treaty, for the better part of a century. And black Americans were present in every one of America's wars going back to the Revolution, serving, dying, and fighting with distinction, in units like the United States Colored Troops during the Civil War, and the celebrated regiments of the World Wars that followed. But for almost 200 years they were barred by policy from rising into general officer rank, no matter how long their families had been in the country, which, unlike most of the men on this list, was often longer than anyone's. The U.S. military stayed formally segregated until President Truman signed the order desegregating it in 1948. The first black American to reach the rank of general, Benjamin O. Davis Sr., wasn't promoted until 1940, nearly a century after Grant and Lee shook hands at Appomattox, and roughly 300 years after the first English ships reached Virginia. Put those two numbers side by side and the shape of the pipeline gets a lot clearer. It wasn't that European immigrant families simply got a head start measured in decades. It's that almost everyone else was legally prevented from even entering the race for most of the distance, arriving at the starting line generations after Washington's family had already finished building an estate. So when you look at this European pipeline and wonder why it's so narrow and so consistent, the honest answer has 2 parts. Part of it is immigration timing, the straightforward story of which waves of people arrived earliest and had the most generations to establish themselves. And part of it, less comfortably, is that for most of American history, the door was welded shut by statute for almost everyone who wasn't already standing inside it. Both things are true at once, and leaving either one out gives you an incomplete map. I'll be honest, this is the part of the search where the fun, coincidence hunting feeling I'd had for the first few hours dropped away and something heavier replaced it. It's easy and genuinely enjoyable to sit with a spreadsheet of immigration dates and feel like a detective uncovering a fun secret. It's a different thing entirely to realize that the neatness of the pattern, the fact that it keeps landing on the same 5 regions instead of sprawling across the whole world the way immigration to America actually did, isn't just a story about who happened to show up early. It's a story about a door that stayed open for some families and stayed locked for others, by design, for most of the same stretch of time. Once you notice that, you can't go back to reading the pattern as pure trivia. It's still fascinating. It's just fascinating in a more complicated way than it looked at hour 1. With that sitting alongside the pattern rather than underneath it, here's where the story stops being predictable. Because when you follow the European thread into the 20th century, it takes the most ironic turn in the entire list. And this is the loop I asked you to hold on to earlier. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the general who commanded the entire Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe and later became president, carried a surname that used to be spelled Eisenhower, a German word that translates literally to iron hewer or iron cutter. Read that again. The man who commanded the invasion that broke Nazi Germany carried a name that is, word for word, a description of hard industrial labor, as German as a name can get. His ancestors were German-speaking Mennonites from the Rhineland-Palatinate, part of a wave of Palatine immigrants who fled religious persecution and economic collapse in the early 1700s and settled among the Pennsylvania Dutch. Dutch here being an anglicized mispronunciation of Deutsch. The name softened from Eisenhower to Eisenhower over generations, quietly enough that most Americans who grew up saying it never once connected it to what it actually meant. Sit with that for a second, because it's almost too on the nose to be real. The man chosen to command the liberation of Europe carried a direct, unbroken paternal line back to German soil. Not a symbolic connection, an actual family name, translated word for word, tracing to the exact region his own armies would eventually help free. If you didn't already know that, you're not alone. I didn't either until about hour 3 of this search, and it's the moment the whole project stopped feeling like trivia and started feeling like something worth actually telling people about. I remember sitting back from the laptop for a second, just to let it land. The guy planning the invasion that would end the Nazi regime and his own surname was quietly translating to iron cutter the entire time. He's not alone in that irony either. John J. Pershing, who led American forces in the First World War and mentored the generation of officers who would go on to command the Second, descended from a German immigrant family whose original surname, Furschen, came from the same Palatinate wave as Eisenhower's ancestors, softened over generations into something that read as ordinary and American. And Chester Nimitz, who commanded the entire Pacific Fleet in World War II, grew up in Fredericksburg, Texas, inside one of the most concentrated German immigrant communities in the country, a town so thoroughly German that English wasn't even the dominant language on its streets well into the 20th century, and where German language newspapers and church services were still common within living memory of people alive today. His grandfather built and ran a hotel there shaped like a ship, still standing today as a museum to Nimitz's own naval career. A strange little detail that feels almost too neat to be real. A German immigrant family builds a ship-shaped hotel, and 2 generations later their descendant is commanding the largest naval war in human history. 3 commanders, 2 world wars, 1 shared thread running straight back to villages along the Rhine. And in every case, the wars they were fighting happened to be against the country their own families had left behind. Not every name on this list carries that kind of dramatic irony, and it's worth including a couple of quieter cases too, because they show something just as important about how these threads age differently over time. George Marshall and Omar Bradley both descended from English settler families who'd been in the country for so many generations by the time they were born that almost nothing about their ancestry stood out as remarkable to anyone, including themselves. Marshall's family rooted in colonial Pennsylvania and Virginia, Bradley's in generations of English farming stock stretching back to the 1600s. The origin point wasn't hidden in either case. It was just worn smooth, sanded down by 10 or 12 generations of purely American life stacked on top of it, until English ancestry stopped being a lived identity and became something closer to a forgotten fact sitting in a parish register 3,000 miles away. Compare that to Eisenhower and Nimitz, whose German-speaking communities had kept language, food, and identity visible and lived in for just as many generations. Same number of generations in the country, in both cases. 2 completely different relationships to where they'd started, and it's a small reminder that how long has your family been here, and how connected do you still feel to where you came from? Are 2 separate questions that don't always move together. So why does the pattern cluster this hard instead of spreading out evenly? Part of it really is immigration math. English colonization was the earliest and most concentrated wave, which gave English-descended families the most generations to grow into positions of standing by the time the Revolutionary and Civil Wars rolled around, while the Scots-Irish and German Palatine waves that followed a century later needed roughly the same head start to produce their own generals a century after that. It's almost mechanical once you see it. Count forward 100 to 150 years from any large immigration wave, and you tend to find that wave's descendants showing up in positions of institutional power simply because that's how long it takes a family to accumulate land, education, and connections inside a fairly rigid social structure. Long enough for a wool merchant's grandson to become a founding father, and long enough for a Palatine farmer's descendants to end up commanding fleets and armies 200 years later. But the deeper part of it, the part that matters more than immigration dates, is what that head start actually bought a family once it had it. Land, standing, access to military academies, a household where command wasn't a distant fantasy, but a plausible next step in a pattern that had already been running for generations. Lee's family had been prominent in Virginia for 200 years before he was born, which meant West Point wasn't an aspiration for him, so much as a fairly ordinary next step for a young man from his particular family, in his particular county, with his particular last name. That's not ancestry deciding outcomes on its own. Plenty of men from old colonial families never rose to command anything, but it's ancestry buying access, generation after generation, inside a system that was simultaneously and deliberately denying that same access to almost everyone who didn't share it. Two forces, running side by side, and neither one fully explains the pattern without the other. There's also a smaller, more human piece of this worth naming, because it's not just about laws and land grants. Once a family had one officer in one generation, it tended to produce another 2 generations later, not because talent runs in bloodlines, but because expectation does. A young man growing up hearing stories about a great-uncle's regiment or walking past a grandfather's sword hanging over a mantle absorbs a sense of what's possible for someone with his name in a way that has nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with which doors he's grown up assuming are open to him. I thought about that a lot while I was doing this because it's the piece that's hardest to put a date or a document to. You can find the ship manifest. You can find the parish register. You can't find the exact conversation at a dinner table 200 years ago where a father told his son that a commission was simply what men in their family did. But you can see its fingerprints, generation after generation, in exactly the families where the pattern keeps repeating and exactly the families where it quietly stops. None of this diminishes what any of these men actually did once they were in command. Lee's ancestry didn't win or lose a single battle. Eisenhower's surname didn't plan a single detail of the Normandy landings. Genealogy explains where the pool of eligible candidates came from. It says nothing about the judgment, courage, or failure of the individual men once they were standing inside it. But it's worth understanding the shape of that pool honestly, both halves of it. The specific European counties that kept feeding it for 2.5 centuries, and the specific legally enforced walls that kept almost everyone else standing outside it for just as long, decade after decade, war after war. Textbooks will spend paragraphs on Lee's tactical instincts, Grant's relentlessness, Eisenhower's coalition building, and almost never mention that these very different men were, underneath it, products of the same handful of migration corridors, feeding into a system that had already decided, by law, who else was allowed to compete. It's not that historians are hiding the second half of that story, it's that pulling both halves together requires treating genealogy and policy as the same subject. And most books about generals are written by people who study one or the other, not both at once. So the next time you hear the phrase, one of America's greatest generals, it's worth holding both halves of that story at once. Not some evenly distributed cross-section of the country, but a handful of counties in England, a handful of clans in Scotland, a county in Ireland, a corner of Ulster, and a strip of farmland along the Rhine, funneling for 2.5 centuries into the same short list of surnames. Inside a system that, for most of that same span, made sure almost nobody else got a seat at the table to begin with. It's not a hidden conspiracy. It's immigration, opportunity, and exclusion, compounding quietly across generations until the pattern is too specific and too uneven to be an accident. And if your own last name traces back to any of those regions, the English counties that fed colonial Virginia and New England, the Scottish Highlands, County Cavan, or any other corner of Ireland, Ulster, or the German Palatinate, you're sharing more than a surname category with some of the most consequential military figures in American history. You're sharing the exact migration story, running on the exact timeline, through the exact handful of ports, just without a battlefield attached to the end of it. And if your name doesn't trace back to any of those places, that's worth sitting with too, because it's very likely not a gap in the historical record. It's the shape of the wall. I went looking for one name on a Saturday afternoon and ended up with this whole map. A pipeline that quietly decided who got to lead, and just as quietly decided who never got the chance to try. I'm still pulling threads on my own family tree, and I'll probably be down this rabbit hole for another few weekends at least, chasing a couple of names that haven't led anywhere yet but feel like they're about to. Tell me in the comments which part of this you didn't already know, and whether your own name showed up somewhere on this list, or somewhere on the other side of it. Either way, I'd genuinely like to know.